Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Matthew Draycott and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you back to this series where I explore my teaching tools and the ways that I teach, and I share that with all of you so that you can take those ideas and practices and concepts. In fact, you can take the whole slideshow and everything else, play with it, use it, build it or rebuild it, and see what you come up with. Now, I mentioned that this was going to be a series, and so far we've only recorded one of these, and that was quite a while ago. But to quote that oft-used phrase, unfortunately, in the interim, life got slightly in the way. But I am now back on track, and I really want to build this into a series of useful long-form and short-form videos where we play with things, we see how they work, you guys come back to me with how you've used something or your ideas and approaches, and we create a useful little library, community, where we're all sharing our approaches to doing this stuff, because I think that's really key. There is so much good practice out there, and I'm just trying to start to shine a light on that from what I do. You may not always agree that what I do is the best way of doing it. Great. If not, tell us what you do. Let's see that and learn from it. But I just want to start to open up that conversation and get it moving. So I'm going to commit from now on to trying to get one of these videos out every month so that you have something and that there is a reason to come and engage here with this bit of the platform. So thank you very much for coming back and looking at this video. I really hope you find it useful. Now in this session, we are going to look at the business model canvas, and there are two reasons for that. Number one, this is a ubiquitous tool. Whether it's business, enterprise, or entrepreneurship education, it is incredibly commonly used. And you may not realize it, but the canvas is actually almost 20 years old. The published work and the sort of first formulations of this were coming out in about 2008. So we've been using this thing for a long time. And that ubiquity is one of the reasons I think it's a good tool to talk about. But with that ubiquity comes a whole range of practice. Different ways that people use it in their curriculum in terms of where they position it, different applications of the tool itself, and different approaches to levels of detail and idea that you put within the tool. And so I really today just want to look at how I do all of that. So from where I place it in the curriculum through to how I actually use the tool with my students, and show you my approach so that hopefully you can take something from that and maybe I can learn something from the conversation with all of you. So without further ado, let's jump in and start to talk about the canvas. And let's start with that piece on context. Where do I position this thing? Now, I've seen the canvas used in a whole range of different ways. My personal view on this comes from two of my close friends. One, Alex Bruton, the other, Jim Shirley. Both of whom have had a real impact on how I think about the journey of business generation to business planning. And actually, even what I think is useful and relevant, because that's changed over the years for me. Now, often I will see people using the canvas at a very early stage. And to some degree, that's okay. But if we think about this in terms of students, very often what students do by using the canvas early is they anchor onto those ideas in that canvas, and it becomes the undercurrent of everything they do in a project, in a module, in a task or activity. And that's not really what we want students to do when we're developing and creating, especially initial ideas. If students have a more shaped concept, it may be more relevant. But certainly when we want them to diverge and get into that kind of more creative thinking space, often the canvas is the wrong tool at an early stage to do that. You'd be much better served with sort of creative thinking activities, ways to develop divergent thought, different kinds of practices at an early point, so that the students really are playing with the problem, the nature of the problem, what the problem is, rather than starting to come up with a solution to it. Once they get to that solution, as I said, very often they anchor, and that's not what you want, especially with undergraduate students. Particularly, I find that is a problem they will have. they'll lock onto it and it won't really change. And getting them to change, even when you challenge them quite directly, can be really tough. So I wouldn't suggest placing the canvas there. And this is very much the influence of Alex's work on my practice. The work we've done together looking at how you create value propositions, how you look at ideation and feasibility has really made me think that actually I don't like using the canvas at an early stage. So for me, if I think about the whole journey from developing an idea through to, say, a business plan or a pitch, for me, the canvas probably comes after the first third, sometimes even after the first half of that initial practice. And I will be using the canvas really to take ideas that people have played with, they've thought about, they've explored in different divergent ways, and get them to converge into 2 or 3 canvases where we really start to look at how that idea works in practice and to play with the different components of it and understand if they fit together. Because that's really the key thing you're starting to do with the canvas. You're starting to look at, does it fit together? Now, where my practice has begun to change more recently, and this is kind of Jim's impact on it, is to say that, you know what? I would have had the canvas as an endpoint and then gone on to a pitch. But talking to Jim, I've begun to realise that actually, maybe then going from the canvas to a more structured business plan is not a bad idea, especially for people who don't have the experience of pitching a business in any context. Because that exercise of business planning helps to clarify out some of those challenges. Now, I'm not suggesting a big, long, detailed plan, but I'm certainly suggesting more than a canvas. So I think, again, I would be going from developing an idea to a canvas, from a canvas to a plan, and then from a plan to a pitch. That, for me, is where I'm beginning to more and more often situate the canvas in terms of modules, curricula, and activities that I design. Now, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that, whether you like it in an early stage, whether you like it later, whether you've replaced business planning with it. I've tried all of these different things. For me, this is the approach that I'm finding works best, and also the approach that I find kind of gets the best results out of my students. So, let's now get into how I use the business plan with my students and what we do with that. So, start by defining a business model, and this is the deck that I use. So I'm going to walk you through this and we'll just talk about some of the things that I do early on. Now, I've already spent a lot of time prior to this talking to my students about that whole value customer piece. So I don't need to unpick that, but what I need to remind them is that that's the core job a canvas is doing. It's describing how your organization delivers and captures value for consumers. And they could be customers or users, remember, because we might be talking about quite advanced kinds of models, two-sided models, for example. But it's that core relationship between value and the consumer that you're trying to get them to consider. That's why I like this slide early on. I then like to just walk people through the canvas. I'll have a conversation about the fact that you're working from segments back this way across the canvas to partners, with kind of cost structure and revenue streams undercutting all of that work. I'll talk about each of the 9 blocks, what should be in them and why, but at a very high level, because then as I go through the rest of this session, we get into much more depth and detail. So obviously, we know what the 9 blocks are. This is just another kind of touch point to go, here they are, talk about them, talk about why they're important. Often I'll get students to talk about what they think at this point as well. Why do they think things might be important? What do they think should be in these different sections? So that as I go through with them and I show them examples, they can challenge their own perception of that somewhat. So as we said, this all starts with customer segments. Now, for this particular slideshow, what I have is a series of slides that give students detail and examples as to what should be in the particular segment that we're working on. So for customer segments, I've got this. My perspective on customer segments is that really 2 or 3 segments is ideal for most canvases. Some may be more complicated, but this is really what you're looking for. These segments should take the form of little pre-personas, where we've got some elements of demographic, sociographic, and or psychographic. There's a good tongue twister there for you halfway through. Demographic, sociographic, psychographic. Can you say those 3 quickly? If you can, awesome. I evidently couldn't just then. So we're looking at those 3 elements being within that pre-persona. And the reason I call this a pre-persona is it's not a full persona. We're not going into lots of depth and detail. What we are trying to do is justify this with a bit of data. Why are you saying this? Where is that perspective coming from? So it's not just, I've had an idea. It's, there's a reason why this person is the person I'm choosing. Now, some businesses won't have 2 or 3 segments. Some businesses may have more. But I generally think this is the ideal number because you've got a backup, basically. You've got directions you can pivot in and explore. You're not pinning yourself down to one particular route. You're still keeping some divergence, although we're starting to factor into a particular area. And remember that the segment is going to be connected to the value proposition, the channels, and the relationships. That's the minimum. I know it should connect into the canvas as a whole, but it's going to really have an impact on those areas, and we can look at each of those as we go through. So here are some examples from previous students that I've taught who've been really kind and let me showcase these to previous student groups. And these are just some different kinds of pre-personas. So you've got 3 kind of different approaches here, 2 that are quite similar, 1 that is very, very different in terms of how it is. So the first 2, they give a good kind of generalized pre-persona. They're underpinned by good data. 1 was in the appendix, 1 put a reference into there. And they give you a good view of who the potential customer for these products may be. Now, the other version of this was from an incredibly complex, really high-level canvas that a student created on a master's project with me, where they had a whole range and they had built this really interesting set of personas that might be appealed to at different times in the life cycle journey of the business they were creating. They had really detailed value propositions and they'd linked it really clearly to channels. So this was an amazing piece of work. Very deep, very detailed, really highly designed. I wouldn't suggest that everybody goes to this level, but for some of your higher level students, this might be a useful approach to take. And it really does show you've thought about the connections and depth between the different sections as well. Now, when I talk to my students about segments, segments are separate if wants and needs justify a different offer, reach through different channels, require different kinds of relationships, have substantially different profitabilities, or they're willing to pay for different aspects of the offer. And the key thing I'll always come back to at this point is to remind my students that not everyone is your consumer. You're not trying to please everyone. You're trying to please 2 or 3 distinct segments that you're defining here that will be the basis of the market that you are going to explore. And that should have already come out of work and research you've done up until now, which shows that these are the markets you want to explore. So in an ideal world, we've done all that work, we've looked at the market, we've done our TAM, SAM, SOM, that's our market sizing exercise. Maybe I'll do a video on that separately. We've looked at how that might work in terms of a profit realization. We understand why they might want this thing, and that's the underpinning stuff that we're then drawing on into the canvas. So the canvas has that really deep linkage to all of that prior work, and this is why I'm saying the canvas comes at a stage later after you've already done that other work. So if you haven't got that other work, just kind of sketching it out here at a very rough level, I don't actually think is the best way to use the tool, because it's almost too disposable. You'd be much better just getting students to write their thoughts, go off and look at them and research them, then come into here. And I suppose as an aside, the general point I'm getting at by reinforcing this is that often it's that conversation about validation and why you're selecting things that, in my experience, students and people pitching get really wrong. They just haven't done that due diligence work, primary or secondary, to really show that that particular segment is the segment they should be appealing to. So please, that's why I'm saying it sits there. With that done, we then move on to value proposition. Now, this is really difficult. I think elucidating a value proposition is one of the hardest things we ask students to do, because it requires actually a very high level understanding of what value is to a consumer. And often we simply don't teach that enough. I really like the FAB model, features, advantages, benefits, with the benefits really being the thing that drives the value proposition. Again, maybe I'll do a separate video on that where we talk about that. It's quite an old school approach, but it really works, and it's so simple to talk to students about. Once they understand that it's the benefit that's the basis for the value proposition, everything else becomes quite easy to talk about. So you can have multiple value propositions within this, but again, you probably don't want lots of them. So this is the kind of advice I give to my students. Need to be linked to specific segments. You can have one. I would never advise more than 4. Even if you've got 4, 5, 6 segments, you don't want more than 4 value propositions. They tend to become very, very generic after that. What we're looking for is unique. If I push you to look all the way back at Michael Porter, and you might wonder why I'm bringing him into this conversation, but actually there's a really relevant point here. When Michael Porter talks about competitive advantage, when he talks about strategy, when he talks about everything comes back to your USP. And really, value proposition USP, they're not that different. People have kind of made them seem very different, but they're not. That's really kind of what we're digging into here. So if something isn't unique, if it's not valuable, if there's no competitive advantage from it because it doesn't deliver significant benefit to the consumer, why are they going to buy it? And how is that a basis for a business that you're creating? So we don't want things that are generic. We want things that are unique, that really communicate benefit and that give big benefit to potential consumers. Again, I have a whole view on that, whether things are really taking pains away, whether they're something that is more disposable for a consumer, or whether they're a nice to have, again, really impacts how you're going to present this to somebody. Ideally, we want to be focusing on people's pains and problems. We want to be addressing those really clearly, and we want to have within that a lot of benefit to the consumer so that this is something they cannot do without. That's the position. If you can get there, then you're going to have a really strong competitive advantage that you can build on. And from a Porter perspective, that's how you build a good business. And to be honest, I agree. That hasn't changed in a lot of years. And again, I think it's something often we overcomplicate with a lot of the kind of lean startup conversation, which has become popular over the last couple of decades. Strip it right back. Make it unique. Lots of competitive advantage. That's how you deliver a successful business. And again, these propositions need to be supported by data and research. If you haven't done that pre-work and you get to here, these are going to be very weak. Now, again, I've got some examples here from some previous students where they've really drilled into this in different ways. One is very much linked, this is the blue one, where they've linked it to the personas that they're then using. Great, nice and detailed. They've got really good referencing here around why they're picking certain things. One is much more narrative, but again, very clear. The other, we've got a kind of blend between the two. So you've got a few different ways here of presenting what's going on at a value proposition level. Well, actually, sorry, I say a few. Really, we've got 2 here, to be fair, because we've got the top and bottom of the same one there, but it's showing you the detail and depth still. So what we're looking for here is, again, clearly why this is unique, how it's supported by data, and from that we should be able to see how it delivers a competitive advantage for the business. So next up, channels. Channels are all about how we reach people. And again, this is one of the sections with relationships that I see students most often get wrong, because it becomes a very generic thing. It'll be like, well, we're going to do some social media, we'll do some TV adverts, we'll do some of this. No. If you know who these customers are, the question you should be answering in the context of channels are, where do you find them? And this should be specific to those customer groups. You might have a range of channels that you're going to work across, but those channels should work for those people. If we're, for instance, talking about social media, talk specifically about which kinds of social media are likely to work for that particular consumer that you have identified based on their age, their demographics, their sociographics that we know about them. And we can do that. We know the sorts of profiles of people on these sites. So this is something you can really clearly do. The same is true of influencer conversations. The same is true of traditional either online, print media. You can do that. We can really get very specific. So again, let's look at some examples here from my students. This is some work where students have given different perspectives. Again, what you've got here is detail and depth with referencing linked to those particular customer groups. This is what I'd be looking for a good response to channels. The next part that people often get wrong, as I've already said, is relationships. Relationships are how you're going to deal with your customer or consumer. Now, this can range from highly automated to highly personal. Generally speaking, the higher the worth of the sale, monetarily speaking, the more personalized the service often becomes. Not always true, but there's a general rule of thumb there. The thing about relationships, and the reason it's important, is because relationships has an impact on resourcing and on cost. This isn't the way people often think about it. People often think about relationships as kind of a throwaway thing. But if you've got very high ticket items that you've got to have a very in-depth personal sale, then that's expensive to do. Whereas if you've got something which is highly automated, that's much, much cheaper. It may not seem it at the outset because you may have to buy in software and design things and utilize AI-based systems, but actually in the long run, it's a much cheaper way to run. So there's a conversation there that needs to be clearly put out because it will have an impact on your cost base. And this is why it's a crucial section to detail out. So again, we'll look at a couple of examples here. Different viewpoints, looking at different levels is the first one. So this goes from quite a high touch relationship and it explores each element of that relationship. I said that in a very weird way, but hey, we'll go with it still. How that will work. On the other side, you've got something which is slightly more generic, but still works. And certainly for an undergraduate or master's student, I'd be really happy to see them thinking about it in this way, because this is better than a lot of the answers that I see. So what we're really looking for here is we're looking for the relationships to be clearly defined. We want to understand the nature of them. We want to understand maybe how that changes as the sale or the value proposition perhaps alters, or through different value propositions or through different sales types. However that's going to be, we want to get good detail here so that we can then funnel that into what that might mean from a costing perspective. And the kind of terminology I expect to see here are things like these. This is the kind of conversation I would want to see somebody presenting in that box, again, with referencing underpinning it so we know why they're making these choices. Next up, revenue streams. How the heck are we going to make money out of this? This is key. And so many people get to this point and are like, I never thought about this. I've got all these bits. I kind of know how they work, but I don't really know how we're costing this thing or the pricing of it or what we're going to do. Again, this should come out of that initial research. If you don't have that at this point, I challenge as to why you're creating a canvas, because you should already kind of know this going in so that you can then see if it works when it's all into the canvas. It shouldn't be something you kind of iterate at that point as you're putting it in. Now, what should be in this section? We're looking at the revenue model. So how will the revenue stream actually work? What's the methodology? What's the pricing strategy? Do we have any key figures? Do we have any relevant projections? There's a lot more depth and detail here than just writing, I'm going to sell it for $9.99 and that's psychological pricing. The more depth we get here, the more relevant this becomes, the more we can understand the sorts of decisions that the person is making, and we can support them, make judgments about that, help them really build and develop what they're doing. So, type of revenue stream, there's a lot of different ways that could work. I want to understand, is it basically a physical sale? Is it some kind of licensing? Is it something else? And how does that operate? And I want them to talk about that in quite a detailed way. I'd expect certainly a sentence or two as an overview of the nature of the revenue stream. Then, within the revenue stream, how is it priced? And pricing strategy is something, again, we could cover in another video, but where does it sit on that spectrum from premium right down to a sort of cost plus or an accessible pricing point? What's the journey there? And again, depending on how you're going to put this forward, there's choices and ideas you'd have to consider there. But I'd certainly want to see people using some of that terminology and presenting an actual number to me. And ideally, baselining that against other things that are there. So if this has competitors, either direct or indirect, they might reference that as well in terms of how they're setting the pricing point. Now, this will be important because it allows me to very quickly go, well, if you sell 10,000 units of this at that price, that works given the cost structure that you've put forward, and that's feasible given the whole customer value marketing approach you're probably going to have to apply. So I can begin to make a really quick decision about whether this thing probably works as a business and the sort of advice I want to give a student about how they might want to tweak it, what else they might want to do. Definitely I want to do that before they pitch it, because the pitch is enough of a pressure test for a lot of students. They'll find that really hard. So unpicking it at this point with them so they kind of pre-prep for that is really, really important. Next up, resources. What are the things that are indispensable to your model? I don't want to know everything. Heavens, I've seen some answers here, my friends. I've seen some answers. I have seen lists and pages of stuff. That is not what we're looking for. I don't want to know everything. What I'm really interested in here is what particular things contribute to competitive advantage. Now, this could be something that's unique to your business. It could be something physical. It could be something intellectual. It could be something human. I want to know those things that make your resource base unique and that give you that competitive advantage over other people in the marketplace. And there must be something there, because you're telling me this business has a competitive advantage already based on its value proposition. You're showing me kind of how it's priced. So you must understand what makes it different and unique in the context of what you're doing. Now, that might be because you've invented something and it's patentable. Fantastic. It might be because you've got a secret recipe and that's something different or new. It might just be because you do something a little bit differently. That's also okay. It might be because of where you are, physical location or online location. It could be because of the people you've got working for you. All of these are fine to talk about, but talk about them, not the whole list, just those things that really clearly underpin the competitive advantage that you're discussing throughout the rest of the canvas. That's what I'd like to see here. Key activities. Again, the advice here is very similar to the previous section. What are the key things you are doing that link and underpin competitive advantage? I don't want to know the whole thing. Maybe it's how you market the business. Maybe it's how you present yourself. Maybe it's where you are or how you produce it. Maybe it's your suppliers and the quality of the thing that you have. Maybe it's the way you run or operate the service. Maybe it's the particular platform you're using. Whatever it is about what you do, that's what should be here. Again, not everything, just those elements that really underpin what makes your business competitive, what makes it different, and what makes it unique. Relationships. Here's another section which often becomes a big list of pointlessness. Here, I really want to know the key relationships that make your business work. Now, you may have already touched on these in things like activities and resources, but here's where we give more detail. So, who is the partner? What is their contribution? Why have you selected them? And show me that they're actually real. There's a lot of a lot of make-believe sometimes in this section. I'm not suggesting anybody particularly lies, but certainly I've seen a lot of these, and when I've talked to students about it and gone, oh, awesome, who is this person? They've gone, well, they don't really exist. I'm like, okay, well, can you find me somebody who does exist, who can do this, who can supply that to you? Because that's really what we're looking for here, to show this thing could be real and relevant. And they don't have to go through all the rigmarole of contacting somebody, but let's say you're going to get something made in China. Go and actually look on Alibaba, for example, find potential suppliers, list a couple out there, talk about why you might select them over others. Build up the plausibility of what you're doing to show me that at least you've got that base level of research. Now, I know that where this is in a curriculum, that might seem overkill, but actually that's just showing me you've done good research, and you can reference that, and I can give you a tick off for doing that. If you're then going to take us through into a pitch or a business plan, I definitely need to know these people are real, because if you're basing your business on somebody else's ability to supply something to you or to provide something or something that underpins what you do, and they are not real and they do not exist, you are never going to get money for this on the other side. It just will not work. So it's not an exhaustive list. It's not everything in the whole wide world, but again, it is those partners that underpin your competitive advantage and showing me why they're there and who they are. That's really key. And finally, we get to cost structure. Now, the reason I've put this piece last is that it's kind of the combination of all these other bits that we've already looked at and talked about. So what am I looking for here? Well, I'm looking to see that you can bring together these ideas about the key infrastructure that underpins your business and give some concept of how it's going to cost. So things like the cost model, figures, any relevant projections, that should all be here. Some references, some data, maybe again, benchmarking to other competitors if that's possible, examples that you've drawn from your prior research. This is what we should be getting in this box. A few sentences that unpick all of that, so that really quickly I can look at this and look at your revenue element, and I can just see, do these two actually pan out? Is this a business that's going to work? Is it going to be profitable? Because if these two sections don't pan out, that's a really big red flag. That means you need to go back and look at this whole business proposition again. I've just put in here quickly some examples of different models that you might use and different features of that model that you might discuss, but it's really down to the particular student or students or group that you're working with to shape that conversation for you. And when you take all of that together, you will have a completed canvas with really not just the minimum detail, but detail that allows somebody to take that forwards into a plan, a pitch, and for it to be a useful tool. Without this level of detail, I would actually argue that the canvas is almost redundant. It doesn't really work. It over-anchors people early on and will push them down a route they may not be ready for. And later, it doesn't help give them the depth or detail they might need to craft a full pitch. So that's why I situate the canvas here, kind of in the middle of my curriculum, certainly within that first third or so. It's why I push for this level of depth and detail in my canvas, and why the prior research is so important to get you there to be able to deliver that. And why, given all of that together, I think this then becomes a really powerful way to explore something, to give feedback on it, to coach around the concept with the people you're working with, and then to develop it down those other routes. I hope this has been a useful little showcase for you about how I teach using the business model canvas, and what I do and what I expect my students and the people I work with to be doing, and how I situate that more broadly. If you found this useful, drop a comment, please do. I have put a link in the description to the slide deck as well, so you can take that away and use it if you'd like. And I hope to see more of you back here soon, when we'll have another one of these videos exploring another topic to be revealed very soon. Take care, have a lovely rest of your day, and I will catch up with you very, very soon. Bye.